So from global migration to the growing power of technology companies, our next two guests are respected experts in the technology space, and they're going to debate the growing power of technology giants. In his new book, Move Fast and Break Things, which is Facebook's Mark Zuckerberg's motto, Jonathan Taplin explores the unprecedented growth of companies such as Google, Amazon, and Facebook, who now enjoy power on par with big oil and big pharma. I first met Rohan Silva when he was senior policy advisor to former British Prime Minister David Cameron, where Rohan helped shape the UK government's technology policy. Today, Rohan is the co-founder of Second Home, a social enterprise that supports creativity, entrepreneurship, and job creation in cities around the world. So to debate the question, are technology giants too powerful? I'd like to welcome Rohan and Jonathan Taplin. You sit on the far side, okay?
Well, thank you, Imran, and congratulations to you and the team for assembling such an amazing group of people here. Jonathan's book, for those of you who haven't read it, is definitely my favorite book of the year. Whatever you think about what we're going to discuss, it really is an incredible read. So Jonathan, Imran slightly teased the audience there about the content of your book. What's the big argument you're keen to get across?
Well, this came out of a personal experience. I worked for Bob Dylan and the band in the late 60s as a tour manager. And the band was what was called, I would call a middle-class group of musicians. They didn't make as much money as Cream or Rolling Stones, but they made a very good living. And Levon Helm was the drummer and the lead singer of the band, and that living continued long after we finished. I made a movie called The Last Waltz with Marty Scorsese and them. It continued because in the 80s, the CD came in and everybody kept making money. And then in 2000, that just stopped. And in 2000, Levon also got throat cancer. And so he couldn't continue working as a musician. And he had no record royalties because everything was free. Nobody was buying CDs anymore. And I could go on in 2005 or 2008, I could go on YouTube and see The Wait or The Night They Drove a Dixie Down, and there were 3 million streams of it, and yet none of that was flowing to the musicians. And so I began to try and figure out what had happened. And, you know, because I ran the Annenberg Innovation Lab at the University of Southern California, I got to meet all the people that made the internet. Tim Berners-Lee, Vint Cerf, John Seeley Brown. And their project in 1968 was a very countercultural, idealistic idea, which was, we need to decentralize the media system.
Right.
Because as we all remember, well, I'm older than most of the people here, but you know, in the US in '68, there were 3 TV networks and 1 newspaper, and that was the media. So the idea of a decentralized media system was a great idea.
Yeah, incredible.
What happened was, in the late 80s, coming out of West Coast universities, a group of libertarians, Peter Thiel, Larry Page, Jeff Bezos, had a very different idea, which was that the internet, because of scale economies, could be a winner-takes-all business. That you could get one search engine and you wouldn't need another one. You would get one e-commerce everything store and you wouldn't need another one. And eventually you would get one social network and you had 2 billion people on it, and why would you need another one? And so they realized that if they could create a media sector where there was no regulation, where there was no taxes, because Amazon could sell books without having to pay sales taxes, and your bookstore had to pay sales taxes, Amazon in the United States put 4,000 independent bookstores out of business. And essentially, there would be no copyright. So YouTube goes to the music business and says, look, your content is going to be on YouTube whether you want it to or not. All you have to decide is, do you want a little of our advertising money or not? And it's a little. If you could get 1 million downloads for a tune on iTunes, you could make $900,000. If you have 1 million streams on YouTube, you make $900. So that scale economy meant that the money went from people who made stuff, journalists, musicians, filmmakers, photographers, to people who owned the portals to which people found stuff, Facebook, Google, and Amazon. And that, to me, seemed problematic. The second problem was not just for creative artists, but was for our democracy. And when my book first came out in the UK, Macmillan said, the second part of the subtitle, which is how Facebook, Google, and Amazon cornered culture and undermined democracy, we have to take out that undermined democracy stuff because we don't know what that really means. And of course, now the paperback's going to come out in a couple of months, and they're putting that back in because, as Brexit showed, people use these platforms, and especially in the United States presidential election, to bring propaganda and fake news into the world on a scale that nobody ever imagined. Facebook 2 weeks ago admitted that 155 million people saw fake Russian propaganda on their network.
So let's pick up on the economic side of that, Jonathan. So, this is a room full of immensely creative people who, I'm sure in different ways, are using technology to make a living, reach new audiences. You can't dispute the fact that the likes of Amazon, Google, etc., mean it's easier than ever before for creative people to reach a global market, find customers around the world, find new revenue streams. That's got to be a good thing that's connected to the scale of those platforms.
I don't dispute that for a second. And as that McKinsey BOF film showed, all of you are going to become more and more dependent on Amazon. Even brands like Nike, which had their own stores, are now realizing that maybe Amazon is the sales channel. And in the US, we call it retail apocalypse. Many, many mid-level stores are going bankrupt. Next year, Kmart and Sears will be out of business completely, and I don't know how many more. So the thing we understand from the book business is that Amazon is what we call a monopsony. That means a single middle platform that can force prices lower from producers. Now, that may be helpful for end customers, retail customers.
Keeps inflation down, helps families.
Keeps prices low. But for people who are producing stuff, whether it's fashion or books, there's a constant pressure to lower prices, cut your margins, do everything. And so that has forced authors into having to take second and third jobs, forced a lot of publishers out of business. And, but Amazon has 75% of the book business. Google has almost 90% of the search advertising business. Facebook has 75% of the social network business if you include Instagram and WhatsApp. And Facebook and Google took 88% of all new online advertising last year. That's a monopoly. And of course, monopolies have other effects.
One of the arguments Jonathan makes in his book that's really provocative is that competition policy, he argues, needs to change as a result, because competition policy in the UK and America just looks at consumer pricing, which is frankly quite sensible. It looks at consumer pricing. You think, though, that should be broadened and reformed?
The initial idea behind antitrust was to preserve competition. In other words, to have a world in which other people can compete against, in 1906, Standard Oil, right?
But for fear that a dominant player would hike up the prices and we'd all get
But also that a dominant player would basically wipe out the competitors. So, for instance, there's an app called Snapchat, which is basically a startup, and began to develop very interesting things called Snapchat Stories. And some of you have probably played with it. And they got a lot of uptake, and they got to about 100 million users. And Facebook came to them and said, we'd like to buy you for $3 billion. Now, that's pretty good for a company that was 1 year old, right? And Evan Spiegel, nice kid in Venice, California, said, no, I think we're going to go it alone. And the Facebook guys left and said, you'll probably regret this. And of course, they went home. They exactly cloned everything that Snapchat did, and now there's Instagram stories, WhatsApp stories, Facebook stories, and they brought them out literally a week before Snapchat went public. So Snapchat went public at $28 a share. Its stock is at $13 a share today, and advertisers have fled them, and they basically knocked them off.
But
completely.
Jonathan, isn't that a sign of competition? Think of when Facebook was growing, Google worked incredibly hard to try and build its own social network. Google Plus, it tried to integrate social into everything it did. Facebook fought back. Google lost that battle. They sort of retreated on social. But isn't this a sign of healthy competition that companies, and not so different maybe to the way that TV companies steal ideas from each other, fashion companies, I'm sure, are constantly borrowing and inspiring each other. This is what the market economy is about, right?
Well, first off, let's be clear what happened between Facebook and Google. Facebook then threatened to go into the search business because it had 2 billion customers. And then they had a nice little meeting, and they said, okay, you stay in social media, we'll stay in search, and we won't bother each other. And that's what happened. I mean, basically, Google shot Google Plus in the head. So,
because it wasn't working, though.
Well,
also
that,
sucked,
you know,
right?
I mean, look, you can apply dollars to all sorts of things, and you know, one could argue that YouTube doesn't really make profits, but they're going to keep it going until it does, until they become the dominant player. I mean, Amazon has shown very clearly that it can run at a near deficit for years and years and years, but just make cash flow in order to make sure that it dominates a business sector. It's going to dominate food in America. It came into Whole Foods, which we used to call Whole Paycheck, and basically cut prices radically. And now Whole Foods is pressuring, you know, all the other grocery chains in America very strongly.
And your book does a brilliant job of charting the implications for music and film industries you know inside out. What about the fashion industry? Because again, people might think, well, you know, Google, Facebook, so on help us reach bigger audiences. Amazon can be used in sort of clever ways. Net positive for the industry.
Well, look, I mean, we all have to be careful in this sense. Amazon completely dominates the book business. Amazon probably would like to dominate the fashion business. At some point, they may actually invest in their own private lines, labels, you know, like someone bought Bonobos, you know, and so now you get this problem of what we call net neutrality, right? So what happened? Why did the EU fine Google $2.7 billion 3 months ago? Well, Google has lots of services that recommend restaurants or recommend hotels or travel services and stuff. And Google was a search engine, which is supposed to be a neutral place, and yet a content provider. But Google was obviously pushing its own content above that of Yelp or anybody else. And that's how they got caught. Now, Amazon is already doing that same thing in the television business, right? So Amazon makes TV shows and movies, and when you go to Amazon Prime Video, you assume you have content from Warner Brothers, Disney, everybody else, but no, the Amazon stuff is always at the top of the stack, always recommending Amazon stuff. So one has to be careful that if you get somebody who ends up having 80% market share or 70% market share of all e-commerce, which is a total possibility. I mean, they had almost 60% on Black Friday. You're going to end up dealing with a gorilla. And sometimes that's not fun.
Sometimes it'll chew your face off. when it comes to advertising, though, and we'll talk about democracy after that, but when it comes to advertising, the likes of Google and Facebook, which, as you point out so eloquently in the book, have absolutely crushed the old advertising industry and model and have taken all that cash for themselves. Isn't that because, in large part because, anyone here who wants to target a particular demographic can do that much better via Facebook than even via TV advertising or sort of old-fashioned
these companies are in what I call surveillance capitalism. So they basically know much more about you than you have any idea of what. So you look at this, I mean, I was at a tech conference, a Google engineer says, you think this is a mirror, but it's a one-way mirror. We're looking on the other side, and we're looking at every intimate detail of your life. And on some sense, that may be fine. You think your driving insurance rates are set by how well you drive. They're not. They're set by where you drive. So if you park your car in a sketchy neighborhood, you're going to have a higher insurance rate than if you park your car in a very posh Kensington, So that's one problem. The second problem is, where does this end? Because we're going to hear a lot about artificial intelligence today. So the Chinese firm Alibaba has a application called Sesame Social Credit. And what it does is overlay your credit score, how well you repay your bank card, with your social media activity. So if you played video games for 6 hours on Saturday,
which I did,
your social credit score would go down because you're considered a slacker.
Right.
If I happened to write a post critical of the Chinese government on WeChat, my social credit score would go down because I was considered unpatriotic. If you happened to cross the street in Shanghai in the middle of the street as a jaywalker and were caught on one of the thousands of ubiquitous cameras that are on the street with facial recognition, your social credit score would go down because you were considered a lawbreaker. Now you'd say, why would anybody be on this? There are 200 million people on Sesame Social Credit, and most millennials use their social credit score, especially the men, on their dating apps to prove that they're very marriageable, patriotic, conforming citizens. That, to me, is problematic. And when social media becomes a force of conformism, which obviously Huxley and Orwell kind of predicted, then you have a problem. The second problem you have is, and maybe this is something that we in this room should consider, it does seem to me that in a lot of ways, the digital age is a deflationary age. You, maybe not in London, but in LA, you can take an Uber, you don't need to buy a car.
Right.
You can go stay at Airbnb, so nobody has to build as many hotels. You don't have to buy a home, you rent a home. The implication of needing to buy stuff is not so strong.
Yeah, and the cost of starting a business has come right down. You don't need servers,
and,
cloud.
And you, from the entertainment perspective, there's so much free stuff, I'm probably not going to go to the paid stuff as much. Certainly the movie business feels like it's failing in a deep way. If that's true, then essentially Facebook puts itself forward as the last solution to the problem of inspiring consumers to do stuff. If I have this device in my pocket which notifies me, hey, you're only 3 blocks away from H&M and there's a sale on that dress you like, bang, bang, push, push, it's always with you, it's the ultimate notification thing. Maybe Facebook will save, this. Who knows?
But the flip side of conformism, I guess, is the means by which a global community is coming together via some of these platforms. One of the teams based at Second Home is called Help Refugees, and they use the hashtag #ChooseLove to build a really incredible movement around refugee giving in the UK. Loads of other examples, from Me Too to and so on. What do you think about that and that
I think
trade-off?
it's-
Do you
I
think the
think
trade-off
it's
is
potentially-
a net negative?
I think it's potentially very useful. The problem is, of course, I've met some of the people who were involved in the Arab Spring, and although it was a good starter, it ended up being the way, once the government changed, that they were all arrested because they were spied on through their social media use. And so one has to be careful. I mean, clearly the Chinese use it as a source of social coercion, and many, many other countries do that. And so we can celebrate this, but we also have to worry. I was in Las Vegas a week after the tragic shooting. And the students came up to me and said, "You wouldn't believe the stuff that was posted at the top of my news feed as to the reason that Hillary Clinton's supporter was the person who shot those people because they were country music fans and they're conservative Donald Trump supporters." And it was all nonsense. But because, as Brexit and other things prove, you can put out fake news, you could put out a post saying, "The Pope endorses Donald Trump," and you could hit it with 500,000 bots, which any of you can buy. If you want more followers on your thing, just go on Google and buy yourself 100,000 followers. They're not people, they're bots, but you can do it. And you hit it with 500,000 bots, it'll go to the top of the Google search algorithm, it'll go to the top of Facebook.
I think BOF Voices hashtag is following the same technique right now. But because I'm aware it's trending. I'm also aware we're out of time. This is a debate genuinely that's going to run and run. Jonathan has kicked off something. He's really touched a nerve. And if you do one thing off the back of this conference, aside from giving to refugee charities, which you should absolutely do, buy Jonathan's book. Don't buy it from Amazon. Don't read it for free.
Go to
Don't read it for free
Rohan's
on
bookstore.
Yeah, don't read it for free on Google Books. I have a bookshop, lots of great bookshops around the place. But please give it up for Jonathan Taplin.